Good evening, everyone. Good evening.
Hi.
Hello.
Good evening. Good evening, everyone, and Happy Youth Day.
Happy Youth Day. Happy Youth Day indeed. If I could ululate, I would, but I'll spare your ears not to do that. Instead, what I will do, I'll jump straight into sharing firstly, before sharing the bios of each person on the panel. I just want to share words that the panelists shared with me before we started about Youth Month or Youth Day. What comes to mind when they think about Youth Day, and the words that we have are, we have the words like reignite, we have challenging, we have torn, we have proud, we have recognition, we have reflection. So these are the words that come to mind when our panelists think of what Youth Day means to them. And so as we have this conversation, I hope a lot of us will reflect even more deeply about what it means to be a young person in 2022. So we are here today because of what this day means, in terms of what this day means in our history as a country. In 1976, young people took to the streets and they marched and expressed their voices about what change they wanted to see. And every year as a country, we remember this tragic day and we celebrate those young people who took a stand against the apartheid government. It's been over 40 years since the Soweto uprising. And the question that we should always ask ourselves is, how is Youth Day propelling us forward as a nation? We should be asking ourselves, where are young people, the current generation of young people, where are they today? What challenges are they facing and how are we supporting them? Speaking of challenges that young people of today are facing, according to the recent stats with regards to youth unemployment, we know that 4 in 10 young people between the ages of 25 and 34 are not in employment. And employment is an intersectional challenge, right? So it's not just simply about young people not being employed at a workplace, but rather it's an intersectional issue that affects not only young people's economic potential, but their confidence and their mental health impact as well. It has a mental health impact on them as well. This documentary that we will be reflecting on and drawing our talking points from, we recently launched it today, and it's by one of our panelists, Sam Flans. He's the filmmaker who's produced this documentary with camera work done by Alpha, as well as commentary by Youth Capital. This documentary really highlights not only the challenges that young people face, but also the solutions that we need to prioritize. And so in this conversation, I really hope that we will really look closely at the stories of the young people shared and understand that our stories as young people matter. And therefore, when we think about youth unemployment, we should always center young people and explore, therefore, the power of storytelling. So speaking of the panelists that we have, we're joined by Sam Flans, who I've already mentioned is the filmmaker. He reigns all the way from the Eastern Cape. He is not only a filmmaker, but he's a musician. He is an actor. He began his collaboration with Woza, which is one of the organizations that we've collaborated with in producing the film. We've also collaborated with One Campaign. So Sam began his collaboration with Woza in 2017. He's become part of Woza's filming training program. And in 2020, he started producing content for Woza, looking at the impact of COVID-19 in local communities. We're also joined by Prof Ariane, who is a chief research officer at SALTRU. Her work involves developing and coordinating a youth focus within the existing poverty and inequality initiative of the University of Cape Town. Prior to joining SALTRU, Ariane, Professor Ariane, worked as a senior research officer at the Children's Institute of UCT for 5 years. Ariane holds a PhD in sociology from UCT and a dissertation that looks at educational decision-making in areas of AIDS. Then we have Dimpho on the panel, a fellow comrade from Youth Lab. Dimpho Lekgeu is a media producer who's engaging in digital media to create an inclusive and participatory youth in Africa. In her current role at Youth Lab, she brings together her passion for media and youth as a community manager for Youth Lab, which is a think tank working to put forward youth perspectives on pressing issues. Following Dimpho, we have Dylan. So we have an array of panelists this afternoon, good people. Then we have Dylan. Dylan Valley is an award-winning documentary filmmaker and educator. He's currently a lecturer at the Center for Film and Media Studies at the University of Cape Town. He's a PhD student in media studies at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. In 2013, he received the Pulsar Fellowship from the University of Southern California, where he received his master's in specialized journalism. I'll pause there because there's so much that Dylan has accomplished in the recent years, but I'm going to move on to our last panelist, who is none other than Quanita Adams, who is a multi-award winning actor, writer, and director. Her career started in theater. It saw her travel the world. On television, she has appeared in many much loved TV series. I'm sure there are fans in the room here, Quanita. You've appeared in many much loved TV series, including the popular TV program, which I'm rather nervous to pronounce because I might just butcher it. So I'm not going to do that. I'll spare everyone the agony of hearing me butcher the name of the television show, but maybe you can assist me, Quanita. And what's the name of the TV show? It's Ari. That's the one. Where she's currently on screen as Mala Tisha. She's also written TV shows, and yeah, she has done quite amazing work. She also recently directed her first feature film, so titled Swirl. Thank you all. I could spend some time just going through your bios. I'm really excited by the fact that you come into the space with such differing and rich backgrounds, and I'm really, yeah, I'm hopeful that our conversation will be inspiring, but also just thought-provoking. Speaking of which, I'm going to jump straight into it and start with you, Sam, asking you as a filmmaker and as a creative director, could you tell us a bit more about the documentary? I've been trying 8 years without a job. There are people in this space who haven't watched it, and so I'd be keen to hear a bit more about it. How did you get the idea? What are some of your learnings in the process of making the documentary? And how did you make choices in terms of what you wanted to focus on in terms of the issue of youth unemployment? Sam?
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Lady. Where do I start? Okay, the idea, how it came about. It was just after the interview I held with Youth Capital. And then I became a fan, following what the Youth Capital organization is doing. Then I was like, oh, this is great, And at that time, it was a time where in my neighborhood, I was the only one who had a job in my age group, Then I was like, hey, this is so serious, and it's something that needs to be out there, Yes, people do know that there's a huge rate of unemployment, but no one really seems to be stressing about it, And now that we are living during COVID-19 time, it becomes more worse and the prices are going up, So how do people survive, So yeah, I approached Youth Capital, and then I asked if we could collaborate in this, So Youth Capital liked the idea, And then we started to sit down and then looked at the directions that we want to take and with the film. So we did our interviews. There was so much being said, you know, but yeah, unfortunately we couldn't put everything or include everything on the film, you know. So because we wanted like to have one direction of the story, you know, many voices, but it sounds like it comes from one person, you know. So this film, people like they share their challenges when trying to get a job, you know, and what they are facing, how the way they live, you know, with being unemployed. So yeah.
Oh, I love the point about different voices, being heard in the documentary, exploring the topic of youth unemployment. It's not often that we hear differing voices from young people, but instead we often hear of the different ways in which youth unemployment is measured. And I'm going to turn to you, Ariane, on that note, just to ask you to help us understand the different ways in which youth unemployment is measured in South Africa. We know that there's an expanded definition. There's, also the number of young people who are referred to as NEETs, meaning they're not in employment, education, or training. So could you help us understand the differences, the different ways in which youth unemployment is measured in South Africa?
It does become quite confusing, doesn't it? It's not only in South Africa. This is a worldwide situation. So people are considered unemployed when they, we have these large national surveys that go out and that ask, like the census. We've all just been approached by the census people. People are considered unemployed when they indicate in a survey like that they are willing to work, actively looking for work. So they have been looking for work within a particular period before the survey is conducted, and they have not been able to find work. So unemployed means you're willing to work and you're looking for work. That would be unemployed. There are, however, quite a few people, especially young people, who say they are willing to work, but they have given up looking for work. So they have become discouraged. When we include the number of discouraged people with the other unemployed people, that's the expanded definition of unemployment. So the unemployment rate that is usually used is the group of people that indicates they're willing to work and they're looking for work. So it's a smaller group than the actual fully unemployed group, because that would include discouraged job seekers. Then there is the need rate. So that is people who are not in education, employment, or training. So that is a slightly different category. It's quite a confusing category because it includes young people who may be taking a break between having completed their matric, may have chosen to take a break between completing their matric and continuing further education or training. But it also includes young people like, there was one young person in the documentary who indicated he was in college, dropped out of college, has been looking for work, but has not found work. He too would be included in the category need. So it's quite important when we think about that we stop every now and then to unpack who is in large categories like that, because their situations are often very different. And using just one description can cloud our understanding of who we're really talking about.
So speaking about, who are we really talking about, I want to ask you, Ariane, to help us focus on who we should be looking at, who we should be keeping our eyes on and mindful of, and specifically through the lens of the work you were doing at the Southern African Labor and Development Research Unit, and specifically on the basic package of support. Based on that work, what numbers do you think we should be keeping our eyes on? Who should we be thinking about when we talk about just broadly the issue of unemployment?
Can I have an hour on my own to talk about that in particular?
Maybe you can just point, you can just give us a hint, and then we'll schedule another webinar where you can unpack.
We know that young people who are not in education, employment, or training are some of the most vulnerable young people in the country. And that is because, and this is captured, I think, quite powerfully in the documentary, that is because a lot of young people in that category remain trapped for long periods of time in that state of what is referred to as neethood, which is not a very nice label to use, but it's one that's used as a working term. And the longer they remain in that state of not being in education, employment, or training, the higher their risk to remain trapped in poverty and the higher their risk for mental ill health. This has come quite clearly out of a lot of the surveys we do. But what's important, I think, to keep in mind, and that too comes out of the documentary, is that that is not a static state. Often when we work with policymakers and practitioners, they ask us, but where are these young people? Why are they not in education, employment, or training? Where do we find them? And, you know, I now have the perfect answer to say, have a look at the documentary. They very often are taking every opportunity they can to look for work or to reapply for training or education, but are running into all these barriers that make it impossible for them to reconnect to education, training, or the labor market. So we see that they churn through these different situations of looking for work, staying at home and not looking for work, looking for education and training, being told they don't qualify, and so being at home again and becoming quite discouraged, and then picking up their courage again and knocking on a door, but being told there's no job opportunity for them. So that constant trial and error of trying to find the connection, whether it's through education or into a job, makes it really very difficult for young people to keep their hopes up and to remain resilient, because all of that also costs money and resources. And again, we've heard it in the documentary, young people don't always have the money even to look for a job or to keep a job.
Right.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. You know, one of the things that I really, really love and appreciate about the documentary is you hear about these issues, Ariane, that you even touched on in the words of the young people themselves. You know, it's something else to read about these challenges, but it's something else to like hear a young person in their own voice, in their own words, describe these challenges and really paint the picture of what these challenges really mean and the impact they have on their lives. And on that note, you know, I want to bring our other storytellers in our panel, Quanita and Dylan, and I want to bring you in just because I want you to, you know, share your reflections around the importance of our stories in our country. You know, what is the cultural importance of these stories, considering, you know, the importance of representation in South Africa, considering the importance of being able to hear directly from young people who have a very intimate understanding of these stories. What is that importance? And then also, you know, another question that I'd like you to shed light on is, can these stories, can movies, can documentaries make a difference? So it's a two-in-one kind of question. And I'll start with you, Quanita. If you could kick us off and just share your thoughts on the importance, the cultural importance of these stories in relation to representation, in relation to hearing young people directly. And then also, can these stories, can a documentary like the one that we're talking about today make a difference?
Yeah, I mean, I think a large failure of where we find ourselves today is this idea of like a reflexive voice. You know, young people are often being spoken at, being told what their experiences are. So this was quite refreshing that in a first person kind of narrative experience, we could hear firsthand from young people, in fact, what the issues are, what the challenges are, what the frustrations are. And I mean, for me, I was so struck. The first voice that we hear is this young man saying, I'm in a house of 13. I literally, like, I paused and I was like, wait, what? And I started it again. And the first thing that we hear is that in one home, he is one of 13. There's one kind of income earner, there's one breadwinner spread amongst 13 people. That is incredibly powerful for me. And that's something that you can't kind of ignore. And I think that when we see ourselves on a screen, be it on a phone, you look at the prevalence of these TikToks and the reels and the Instagrams and the lives, and even something like this. I think that what social media has done, and often rightfully it gets a bad rap, but I think what it has done, it's really democratized storytelling, and it's taken the power of storytelling back into the mouths of ordinary people. And so I think that when young people see themselves reflected, because trust and believe, he's not the only man in a house of 13 where he is the sole income earner. And I think that when other young people see their own stories and their own struggles reflected, that resonates very powerfully. And I think that, there's something about storytelling that's quite primal. I don't think that there's a culture in the world or a people in the world who at their core don't have some kind of storytelling, story sharing kind of cultural practice or tradition. It's the way we communicate ideas. I mean, everything's a story. Our constitution, that's heralded as one of the most, evolved constitutions in the world, started out as the exchange of stories. We're going back to the Congress of the People. These were ideas that then became enshrined. And I think there's something so primally powerful about the act of storytelling and story sharing, where we begin to disseminate ideas. And as a storyteller, I was very struck by the power of these young people who narrate their stories and the real fear of someone who is standing on the edge of 35 with the panic of like, guys, by the time I hit 35, I'm done.
Sure.
And, I'll hand over to Dylan, but that was something that hit me as an audience, as a viewer, as a watcher. Like even then, I switched off my story brain and I was just like, guys, this is deep.
It's almost like it nudged you to like, okay, what can I do? Right?
Yeah.
Dylan, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think Juanita said it really well. The power of storytelling is huge, and it's, helped to shape the world. If you think about, if we just think back to like June 16, 1976, the storytelling from that day, and the images that came out of South Africa of this violent apartheid regime that was killing the youth of the country at the time, really helped to mobilize a lot of support for the anti-apartheid movement. And for a lot of people, it's like the first time they actually understood how brutal the apartheid regime was because of the storytelling that was coming out of that day. If you think about stuff like things like, George Floyd's murder was filmed by a young woman, a teenager, a Black woman called Darnella Frazier. And that, kickstarted Black Lives Matter again all around the world in 2020 when everybody was at home in lockdown. So, and you think about the murder of Andries Satane, we wouldn't have known who Andries Satane was if somebody wasn't filming Andries being attacked by the police. So if you think about all these things, you see how important storytelling is, but also like these digital tools, like Quanita was saying, we've all, a lot of us have smartphones now. Not enough people in South Africa, I would say, have them, but most of us, the youth, have access to a smartphone, and we have cameras on them. There's ways of telling stories. I think Samuel did a great job with this documentary in terms of getting people's stories together, and also, like hearing from people firsthand what the experience is like behind the statistics. And I think it's so important that we understand the stories behind the statistics, because it's through the storytelling that emotionally you get people to move on an issue. And that's the power of documentary filmmaking and filmmaking in general, or art in general, is that it works on the emotions.
Right.
And that is something that you can't always quantify, but is super powerful and is very needed, especially in the world that we're living in now. And that through that emotional connection with the story, that is how people tend to be moved on an issue and will
Sure.
want to enact change. So,
Right.
so yeah, well done again to the filmmaker for making this film.
Awesome. Two things I want to say before I bring you in, Dimpho. Firstly, I want to encourage everyone who's joined us. I see the numbers are gradually growing, more people are entering the space. Please feel free to ask a question, to make a comment. You are as much part of this conversation as the panelists. So yeah, don't hold back. Do share your thoughts. And maybe as a prompt, you can share how you've seen the power of storytelling. You know, what examples have you seen? I know Dylan, spoke about the Black Lives Movement and how that has been fueled by stories that have been captured on people's phones and circulated. So please feel free to also share your own examples of how you've seen the power of storytelling. Dimpho, I want to come to you and talk about the value of listening directly, right, from young people. How you've seen the value of that in terms of the action that has come out of that, how it's translated, how that act of listening has translated to making a difference in the work that you've done. How, can you just talk a bit about the value of listening directly from young people and how that's translated to itching forward and creating some change? And then also, if you could share the importance for creating spaces where young people can come and share their experiences and their opinions.
So I was just saying that, that's basically my job description. Like my whole job at Youth Lab is about creating spaces where we dialogue with young people. And I love that we're not just talking about listening to young people, but actively listening to them, right? Because I think sometimes when we come into spaces, even when we say we've created platforms for young people to talk about their experiences, we often show up with like preconceived ideas of how young people are and how young people think. So for example, there's this very false narrative when we talk about like youth and political participation, for example, that, young people are apathetic. That's why they're not voting. That's why they don't show up in like meetings in the community. That's why, they're not political active in like local and like national political structures. But there's nothing that could be further from the truth, right? It's when you dialogue with young people, you'll find that actually young people are not opting into these things because they don't believe in them. They haven't seen that they're working. And so for me, that's just one example of how listening to young people is important. But I think even more important than that, it's like allowing young people to share their experiences as they are. One of the things I really liked about the documentary is that there was no at the end, so what do we do now? There was no, so how do you think we can solve this problem? Because oftentimes, like when we talk to young people, we always want to find solutions, and that's important. But I think it's also important to create spaces where young people can just share their experiences. Like sometimes that's all that needs to happen. Like it needs to start with that, young people just having a space to say, this is how we are experiencing this country. This is how policies are affecting us. This is how we're experiencing our communities. As maybe like a starting point. So I think those two things are very important. I think listening to young people actively and also just creating space where young people can talk without there being any expectation of them always having to have answers.
I love that. And you're right. I think, before those conversations can translate into solutions, one must take the time to just listen. Listen to what young people have to say, because when you genuinely actively listen, you will have that genuine reaction that I'm actually going to dub a Quanita reaction. You're like, wait, what? When you really listen, then you'll be able to have that wait, what kind of reaction. And in the documentary, there are quite a number of moments where I had a wait, what? Just in terms of not only the challenges that the documentary highlights in terms of those challenges that young people face in education and transitioning, but also looking at the initiatives. The documentary shows that there isn't a scarcity of an initiative when it comes to youth unemployment, yet the needle has not shifted. And so to that end, Ariane, I want to bring you back in and ask, what are some of our recent successes and some of the projects that have potential but need to be tweaked?
Can I take a little step back there? Because I think it's quite important to think about how the challenge has been approached by government and civil society. And when we look, as you say, there's no shortage of interventions and points of focus, but a lot of that focus has been quite scattered and shattered across many different departments in government, many different civil society approaches and programs. And what we actually see is young people falling through the cracks of the systems, right? It comes out quite clearly, I think, in the documentary. There isn't really a very comprehensive, integrated approach that would demand of all these players in the systems to think collaboratively and cohesively about how we begin to solve this. It isn't only a problem of higher education. It isn't only a problem of the Department of Employment and Labor. It isn't only, and so for a very long time, what we've seen is this kind of fragmented approach where interventions and initiatives sit in pillars and don't connect. And when they don't connect, that's when barriers have the opportunity to become even bigger, and it's left up to young people to try and figure out how to get past that and into the next piece of the broken pathway. And so I think what we've seen, and I saw the invitation of the SABC in the chat about the president's talk, but I think one promising intervention that we have seen sprout up over the past couple of years is this newly launched presidential youth employment intervention. And I think it is promising because it is quite a real targeted invitation to the different players within government and outside of government to come together and collectively and collaboratively think how this can be solved very practically, and how different departments and service providers begin to think from the perspective of a young person. So very often we see service providers think, well, I'm here. It's up to young people to come and find me. But the question really is, okay, how do you begin to think from this point of a young person that doesn't know how to find you? And so that's quite a big ask of these different stakeholders. One part of that presidential youth employment intervention is the creation of a national pathway management network, which aims to bring, again, the different players together and aims to provide a platform for young people where they could find information on training, learning, and earning opportunities in one central place. So they wouldn't have to go and find all that information in many different places. They can find it on one coherent place. That's the aim. We're not there yet, but that is the aim. So there's sayouth.mobi, which is a data-free platform that young people can register on, and where opportunity providers can indicate to young people that these are opportunities. They managed in the past couple of years and throughout lockdown to invite more young people to register onto the platform and to place a lot of young people, for instance, in teaching assistant jobs across the country. I think what is necessary, and I think Youth Capital is doing a pretty good job at this, is to hold these new interventions and approaches to account and to ask, okay, so when you place these young people in these job opportunities, what is that like for young people? And is that enough? Is that enough for the young people who are placed in these opportunities to then move forward, to be more resilient, to be more independent, and to understand how to navigate these systems? Like, is it enough to put them on a longer term sustainable trajectory so that by the time they're 34, they're not panicking anymore about the fact that they're going to be 35 and therefore not young anymore? So there's a definite need to hold that the different stakeholders in that new intervention to account and make sure that we know whether what they're doing is really helping young people move forward. I think I'll leave it at that because again, we can talk.
No, yeah, you've shared some really valuable nuggets, in terms of what you can do. I love the point about holding government accountable about the interventions that they've designed. Whether are they really serving young people in the way that they need to be serving young people? In case you've just walked in, welcome. We've been reflecting on the documentary, and we've been talking about not only the challenges but the solutions, and even more importantly, we've been looking at why it's important to understand young people's lived experience of the challenges, that they experience when it comes to youth unemployment. I want to look at how we can support young people in a more meaningful way, and maybe start at it from a storytelling angle. Lucindiso in the documentary speaks about his fear of becoming unemployable, right? And therefore there's a call in his concern for to be supported. It's almost as if he's saying, yo, wait, young people need to be supported because there's an urgency here. As storytellers, Quanita, Dylan, and Sam, how can you ensure that urgency is heard, and how can you call for ordinary South Africans to support young people like Lucindiso? I hope my question is clear. If not, please let me know. Dylan, I'll start with you actually, and then Quanita and Sam, you may go ahead.
Yeah, so if I understand it correctly, so you're asking how can we make sure that these kinds of voices are heard, right? And how can we?
And how can you call for support from ordinary South Africans? So not only that, ordinary South Africans hear the fear that Lucindiso has, but also understand how they can meaningfully support young people like Lucindiso.
Yeah, I mean, the film is like a great start in terms of that. So in touching on what I was saying earlier, getting these stories out there is super important. Also, as Quanita said as well, like it's also about being reflected. So people seeing that their stories are, that there's so many people with this story out there, and we don't always see these stories when we, switching on the television, or we might see it in the news, but we'll see like the statistics and that kind of thing. We won't get the stories behind it. So I think it's also up to us to use the different tools that we have at our disposal to tell these stories, to get them out there, and to work in an interdisciplinary way, which means like storytellers like Samuel continue to work with people like Youth Capital, and start to work together to come up with these solutions. Also thinking about ways in our own communities and ways that we can all get involved, using social media as well, like in the ways that happened across Cape Town with the community action networks in 2020, where people were organizing in their communities to this very common threat of COVID. I think we need to see inequality, poverty, unemployment as an epidemic that is like decimating our population, and we need to stand together because it affects us all. It's not just about the people we see in the film, but it's also about me. The fact that our unemployment rate is this high, it affects all of us personally, and so we need to see it as urgent in that way, and it's through urgent storytelling we're going to get people mobilized in that way, I think.
I love that. I mean, one thing that I'm picking up from what you're saying that stands out to me is how you as a storyteller can contribute in framing the issues. And that's incredibly important. Quanita, Sam, would you like to add in your thoughts to what Dylan has shared?
Yeah, just very quickly, I 100% agree with everything that Dylan has said, but I just also want to say and reflect on the fact that as South Africans, we have a very strong history and tradition actually of storytelling and how that resonates onto a political spectrum. And I just want to remind everyone of that great television series called Soul City, which was like from, you know, it was a youth focus, and it started out actually as part of an HIV, TB, and AIDS kind of awareness campaign. And it brought so much attention immediately and initially to the plight of young people, or child-headed homes, or whatever it is that young people were being affected by in terms of the scourge of HIV and AIDS, and then TB and all these opportunistic infections. And it was an incredible educational tool. But what it wasn't was like doctors and nurses going, you've got to do this, you've got to do that, and stop doing this and stop doing that, because it actually used the lives of real characters in a way like a parable or an analogy to spread kind of information. And it was very, very powerful. So we come from that, actually. We come from a tradition where we use storytelling to agitate and motivate for political will, and that has kind of policy implications. And then the second and the last thing that I want to say is, can you be a gatekeeper? So listen, guys, I'm an actor, right? I pretend to be other people for a living. But what I do have is the ear and the eyes of several thousands of people, sometimes millions of South Africans. And so what can I do as Quanita in my personal capacity in a small way to help attend to the issue of unemployment? Well, what I can do is when people reach out to me and they say, listen, sis, I've got a script, I've got an idea, I can say, check here, let me tell you where to go. Come, I show you. I can't get you inside this room, but my foot is here in the door. So if you've got tackies on, you're going to run. That's what you're going to do. I'm going to hold this door open for as long as possible, and then you're going to take your tackies, you're going to run into the room, and you're going to make it count. And sometimes I think that there is a panic when we get information, that if we share that information, then the thing that was meant for me is going to be taken by someone else. And that's also not always real, but it's part of the paranoia of where we find ourselves as, look, I'm not young, but as someone who deals with unemployment quite often and frequently, I feel like, well, if I've got this, I better keep it. Otherwise, someone else is going to take it. And the fact is, the more we share, the more we create. And so we need to become our own brokers, and we need to become brokers for other people. And if you find yourself at a door and you find that you have the strength to hold it open, hold it open.
I love that.
And I think that that's what's so powerful about what Sam has done, is that he's taken this thing, because it's also Sam's story. It's also the story of Sam. It's the story of a young filmmaker in what can be a quite brutal industry, actually. And he's going, yeah, I made a thing. And so to Sam, I say, if a young person in our industry approached you and say, oh, bra Sam, like, I have an idea. Can you be a broker? Can you be the kind of boom operator that we dream of for ourselves? And that's what I'm going to say.
Well, thank you, Shucks. Man, what you said has made me think about, you know, the importance of social capital, which we advocate very strongly at Youth Capital. You know, that young people need people like yourselves who will not open the door, but keep the door open, who will point you in the right direction, you know, who will say to Lucindy, so this is what you can do. Yes, the reality is you are approaching the age where you will no longer be considered, quote unquote, a young person, but this is the route that you can take. This is what I have done. You know, share the tips, share the advice. And that's really a meaningful way that we can support young people. And I also like the point that you made about how this is also, like, the documentary is a story about filmmaker Sam, you know. And I guess on that note, Sam, I'd like to hear from you about, you know, what is your role in telling more stories about how young people can be supported using film as a way of sharing information, you know, so sort of as a social capital tool. You know, what are your thoughts around that? Film as a tool of building young people's social capital in terms of sharing information.
Thank you. I think you know, storytelling is another way of fighting you know, struggles. Telling these stories, the fact that there are people who are willing to share, it means like there are so many people who are experiencing that, So to using films as a tool to tell those stories, I feel like it's how would I put it? I think it plays a huge role in putting out the voice of these voiceless people.
Yeah, no, definitely, and giving context, I guess, to also, to what young people need over and above what we often hear. I know today we heard our presidents address the nation and speak more directly to young people, and I see people in the comments have shared that. My hope is that after watching the documentary, you can really then go back to the president's speech and absorb it with that lens of hearing young people's stories and sort of juxtaposing that with what the president addressed, because it's always important to be mindful of young people's lived experience as we think about the solutions that are needed to address the challenges that they face. I'm aware of time, and I'm trying my level best to honor the time that we've agreed upon. Before we wrap up, I want to come to you, Ariane and Dimpho, and ask you, what are some of the ways in which documentaries like this one could be used to advocate for solutions and for an approach that puts young people first? How can we make sure that decision makers listen to young people? Dimpho, I'll start with you and then I'll move on to you, Ariane.
Yeah, so I don't know if I know how to answer the question about getting decision makers to listen to young people. It's literally what we're still trying to figure out. I mean, you'll know this, Youth Lab and Youth Capital do a lot of work to create platforms that allow young people to have a voice and kind of bring decision-making and governance closer to young people. And so I think it's important to continue doing that work. We have a WhatsApp policy group. We try and draw young people into various, bill and policy processes. But I think it's important to use stories like this because one, and this has been touched on, you're hearing about the lived experiences of young people from young people. It really, I think it drives home the point that every quarter when there's a quarterly labor force survey and we listen to how much unemployment has increased, because we hear it all the time, we really lose sight of the fact that these are people behind numbers. Like these are stories, like these are individuals. And although they may all be unemployed, all of them have a different story to tell about how they're experiencing and navigating unemployment. And so when we have that in mind, I think it enables us to design programs and initiatives that are more impactful, but that are really more compassionate. Someone mentioned this week how you can kind of see in the different programs and initiatives that the government keeps rolling out that there's an element of compassion sometimes that's missing. I mean, I think the 350 grant is a fantastic example, right? Of how far removed maybe from the realities of just ordinary South Africans and ordinary young people decision makers tend to be, because you would know that 350 in this South Africa, in this economy, although it's a great step forward, it's just simply not enough to help young people meet their needs, to help unemployed people meet their immediate needs, and also then afford the cost of job seeking. So I think storytelling is important because it really allows us to design programs and initiatives that are not just about numbers, that are not just, focused on impacts and like large scale impacts, but really allow us to be policymakers, I think, that have compassion. Which I think is a very, very important element. Something else I wanted to touch on with regards to storytelling, Quanita mentioned this earlier on. about how social media has really allowed us to democratize storytelling and democratize, who has access to an audience. One of the things we do at Youth Lab, for example, is like we're always dialoguing with young people on social media, and I think that's very important. It's very important to reach out to young people where they are, because young people are always willing to talk and share their experiences and give their inputs. But I think we validate that and we affirm to young people that their experiences matter when we create platforms for them to talk about those things where they are, instead of expecting them to kind of always find us. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Ariane, I think if possible, I know this might be a big ask, but I guess in addition to what Dimpho has shared, maybe you can share how we can make sure decision makers, listen, and as someone who works very hard to create a framework of collaboration between different stakeholders. What are your thoughts on how we can make sure decision makers listen to young people, how we can make them aware of a documentary like the one that we are talking about today, so that they design programs that are compassionate towards young people. I don't know as I said, I know it's a big ask and we might need another webinar to unpack your answer to that question, but I'm keen to hear your initial thoughts.
Well, I mean, I would agree completely with what Dimpho was saying. It's if we would have the answer to that, maybe we wouldn't all be in this conversation. I had a conversation many years ago with someone who was responsible for running large-scale campaigns towards the US government. And I asked this question. I was like, how is it possible that some situations that are so obviously wrong continue to exist? Well, how is it that policymakers just can't seem to get to this reality of what is going on? And he just very calmly told me, this is not unique to South Africa. The only thing you can continue to do is to bring the evidence consistently and all the time, and with an incredible amount of patience, and by bringing more and more people around the table that continue to tell the same story in several different ways, because it's not an either or. Right? So some policymakers will hear the narratives and others will look at the numbers. It's just a reality. And I think by bringing it together and by very consistently continuing to build the body of evidence, which is, it's irrefutable. We've got, as Dimpho was saying, we've got the QLFS coming out every quarter. We've got these narratives that we can collect on a daily basis, but it's a matter of bringing them all together in a very coherent voice, and to decide on, this is the message we will continue to hammer on, and we will continue to invite decision makers to listen to. It's the only way. But it takes a lot of effort, and it takes a lot of takes a lot of stubbornness, I think, to just continue to bring that same message with more and more evidence, narratives, right, and numbers.
Absolutely. I love that. Honestly, the stories of young people are a very strong body of evidence that can be presented to decision makers. As we approach the end, we might just go over by a few minutes. So we will stick to about an hour and 10 minutes of our time. As we approach that end, I'm keen to know from Sam, Quanita, and Dylan, what would your encouragement advice be to aspiring filmmakers, to young people who want to create stories that will serve as a body of evidence that can be presented to decision makers? What advice would you give them about creating those stories? They might be watching, taking notes. This might be a good chance for them to gain the knowledge, gain the information that they need. Almost like this webinar becomes a tool for social capital to some extent. What would you say to them? Dylan, I'll start with you and then I'll move on to you, Simon. Last, but certainly not least, Quanita, I'll ask you to respond last. Dylan?
Yes, thanks. Yeah, so if they're filmmakers who are wanting to do this kind of work, and in terms of doing socially responsive work, I think it's important to firstly, think strategically, go to film festivals, attend festivals, try and get your work into a film festival where you can meet other filmmakers and producers who can help you to make your next project. Apply to film funds, apply to the National Film and Video Foundation's rolling calls throughout the year, check out their website, the NFVF, Google them, and they're funding young people constantly, and also like attend their workshops that are available to help you with putting together those proposals, try and get help from others in terms of writing proposals to get funding to make films. It's really hard to make documentaries. So if it's don't beat yourself up about it. If it's like, if you're not making money from it, nobody's really making lots of money out of documentaries, especially like social like documentaries. That's not kind of like this high entertainment work. And Samuel can talk a little bit more about this, but, work with organizations, find organizations like Youth Capital and see how you can use your skills to partner with them and mobilize those resources that they are able to, mobilize, find ways of adding value to the work that organizations are doing, like Youth Capital and the way that Samuel has done here. Right. And if there's a story that's really burning on your heart, then, like take your camera and go shoot it, or do it on your smartphone, right. Like find a smartphone and shoot it on there. There's all kinds of free filmmaking, editing tools out there now, especially with like mobile stuff. There's a lot of free editing and filmmaking tools that you can download. It's not an easy journey, but it's worth it. Right. I would say. And yeah, there's a lot more that I could say, but good luck.
Thank you. No, you shared a lot of, noteworthy points, very valuable advice. And I'm sure a young person who's other young person who's in the space, or someone who knows a young person is taking notes and will definitely share those notes with the young people that they know. Samuel, what's your advice?
I don't have a lot to say because I'm still a growing baby in this. So, but I would say getting into filmmaking, and the best way to learn in this is to make mistakes, because if I look at documentaries that I produced in 2020, I don't feel the same as I did when we published those, So, and as time goes by and keep making and on doing this thing, and I grow, there's always something different that I learn. So, to a young filmmaker, I think you need to be a good storyteller, just do a lot of research, to make sure that you know what you want to share with people, and as you are maybe shooting or editing, put yourself in that corner of someone who will be watching your film, ask yourself the questions that they would ask, sure, themselves after watching. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Samuel. I love the point you make about learning through mistakes. That's really the best way to learn. Quanita, what would you like to add to what's been shared?
Yes, I love everything Dylan said. I love everything that Samuel said. And I think just to tack onto that, firstly, it's okay if you're tired. It's not unreasonable that you're tired. It's not unreasonable that you're in this little gap where you just want to take a break and tap out. That's okay. It's not your responsibility to fix this for institutions. It's not your responsibility to attend to this on behalf of like the system, number one. So if you're tired, you need to rest. And then when you find yourself in the position where you have some strength to move yourself forward, I think, Dylan spoke about applying for funding, make yourself known. That's very important. If you want to write scripts, are you reading scripts? If you want to make plays, are you watching plays? Are you immersing yourself in this industry? But I think at the core of storytelling is curiosity. And can you ask the difficult questions? And then can you hear the difficult answers? And somewhere in between the question and the answers, can you make the work? Can you stay curious? And so that's my challenge and my invitation to storytellers out there, including these incredible panelists who I'm sure kind of swing quite wildly between being very tired and then being highly motivated. So thanks to you guys, because I think at the heart of it is this curiosity. Can we stay curious? Yeah.
I love that. And to anyone who hasn't watched the documentary, I urge you, let your curiosity lead you onto the link where the documentary is. It's been shared, and it will be shared before we part ways. So do go and watch the documentary. But not only that, I encourage everyone to be curious about young people's experiences. Listen to Dimpho's point earlier about being an active listener. Be an active listener. Many opportunities are presented to us to hear a young person, and when we do that, we figure out, what are the gaps, even when it comes to social capital. What are they needing help with? Is it information? Can you provide them with just like the correct information, the correct direction where to find information? Is it about having a mentor? So yeah, let your curiosity not only lead you to watch the documentary, but in your daily life, may it lead you to listen to young people that you encounter on your journey, wherever it may be. Thank you all for your time. I really appreciate what each and every one of you had to say as panelists, and to everyone who joined us as an audience member. I saw there was a lot of conversation happening in the chat, some of it in relation to what the president had to say earlier today. And to that, I really want to reiterate what I said earlier. Watch the documentary, and if you can, go back to what the president said and see, how young people's lived experiences, whether or not they shape the interventions that our decision makers design to address the challenges young people face. And also, lastly, before we part ways, if you would like to also screen the documentary, so today across the country, many young people who are watching the documentary. In fact, I want to do a quick shout out to Sunshine Cinema, who hosted a screening in Kimberley and in Bloemfontein. Just want a quick shout out. I know, Dylan, you are associated to Sunshine Cinema, so thank you, Sunshine Cinema, for organizing those screenings. But if you also would like, if you are sitting in the space and you'd like to host a screening, we encourage you to do so. All you'll need is just your mobile device or a laptop. There is a guide on our website where you can see the questions you can ask post the screening. So go onto our website and you will find the facilitation guide that will help you facilitate the screening, particularly the discussion post the screening. But also you can just reach out to us on our WhatsApp line if you would like to host a screening, just need support. We're happy to give support, just like give some pointers on how you can host your screening. Secondly, if you would like to be part of the work that Youth Capital does, Ariane spoke about the importance of collaboration. We cannot solve youth unemployment in silos. Collaboration is important. And so we invite you to join Youth Capital by understanding the action plan. To join the action plan, you can find the action plan on our website, and you can join us there. And that's it. Those are the two parting points I'd like to make. But more than anything, I want to reiterate my gratitude. Thank you all so much for the time you spent with us this evening, reflecting on the documentary. I've been trying 8 years without a job. From me, Good night.